We live in an era where self help is everywhere. Personality tests, therapy apps, meditation guides, endless advice on how to find yourself, all available in seconds. We have never had so many tools, so many answers, so many paths to discover who we are. We have never felt so confused about our own identity. This growing confusion that affects millions of people is often interpreted as indecisiveness, weakness, or lack of self awareness. But what if this conclusion is wrong? What if the problem is not that you don't know yourself, but that you have been living as someone else? What if you are not confused? You are simply uncentered. This is exactly the insight that Carl Jung, one of the most profound explorers of the human psyche, spent his life trying to understand. Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist who experienced his own mental breakdown, a period of intense inner turmoil that almost destroyed him. Yet from this darkness, he emerged with a revolutionary understanding that the human psyche has a center, a self with a capital S, and that when we lose connection to this center, we fragment, we scatter, we become strangers in our own lives. For Jung, human beings are not driven primarily by instinct or social conditioning, but by a process he called individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness, toward becoming who you truly are at the deepest level. This is not about perfection or achievement. It is about integration, about gathering the scattered pieces of yourself and returning home to your own center. This thought sheds a disturbing light on what we face today. If psychological health comes from being centered, from living in alignment with your true self, what happens when an entire culture teaches you to live from the outside in? What happens when you spend decades performing, wearing masks, adapting to expectations until you no longer remember what is genuinely yours? This video proposes a radical reflection. Perhaps you are not confused. Perhaps you have simply been living so far from your center for so long that you have forgotten what it feels like to stand on solid psychological ground. The confusion you experience is not a defect. It is a compass trying desperately to point you back toward yourself. And this is exactly what we will explore. How modern life pulls us into persona living, into being what others expect rather than what we are. How this disconnection from center creates the experience of constant confusion. And how the insights of a man who mapped the depths of the human soul can guide you back to yourself. If you have ever felt like you don't recognize your own life, like you are living someone else's story, like every choice feels wrong because none of them feel like yours, this video is for you. Because perhaps you are not broken. Perhaps you have simply been wandering too far from home, and it is time to find your way back. The human psyche was not designed to live permanently on the surface. For millennia, human beings developed through initiation rites, solitary vision quests, encounters with mystery, moments that forced them to go inward, to confront themselves, to discover who they were beyond the roles they played. But in recent decades, something has shifted. We have entered an era of relentless externalization, where your worth is measured by metrics, followers, achievements, status symbols, where every aspect of identity is performed, validated, adjusted based on the responses you receive. What was once considered inner life, the private world of dreams, reflection, authentic feeling, is now either monetized for content or dismissed as self-indulgent navel-gazing. We curate identities, present versions of ourselves, scroll through others' highlight reels, not to connect with depth, but to maintain the performance, to keep the persona intact. And Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear, the social face we show the world. And he was clear, the persona is necessary. We need it to function in society. But here is the danger. When the persona becomes the only thing you know, when you live entirely from this outer mask, you lose contact with the self, with your psychological center. What was meant to be a useful tool becomes a prison. The more we live for external validation, likes, approval, being seen as successful, attractive, competent, the more we abandon our own inner ground. Our psyche begins to experience what Jung called dissociation, a splitting, a fragmentation, where the conscious ego becomes completely severed from the unconscious, from the deeper parts of who we are. This is the invisible root of modern confusion. Constant external living kills inner knowing. When every decision is made based on what looks right, what others expect, what fits the image, you lose the ability to sense what is actually true for you. It's not that you cannot make decisions, it's that you have been asking the wrong question. You have been asking, what should I do? When the real question is, who am I? And this leads us to an even deeper realization. If we are so busy maintaining the persona, managing our image, living up to expectations, are we not also avoiding the one encounter that truly matters? The encounter with ourselves. Because it is in the depths, in the unconscious, in what Jung called the shadow, that the truth of who we are resides. As Jung warned, reflecting on the modern epidemic of neurosis, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But it is precisely this acceptance, this integration, that restores psychological wholeness. In the next segment, we will explore what happens when you live divided, when the persona and the self drift so far apart that confusion becomes your constant companion. Why does everything feel unclear, and what are we losing when we lose our center? What happens to a psyche that never turns inward, that never questions, that is never allowed to simply be without performing, without adapting, without measuring itself against external standards? The answer is devastating. It disintegrates. The uncentered psyche does not choose. It merely reacts. It does not know. It merely guesses. And over time, this psyche loses its most essential quality, coherence. A centered person knows things they cannot always explain why they know, but there is an inner resonance, a sense of rightness or wrongness that guides them. This is not instinct. It is contact with the self, with the deep organizing principle of the psyche. But when you live entirely from the persona, when every choice is filtered through what you should want, what makes sense to others, what fits the narrative you are supposed to embody, this inner knowing goes silent. In its place, confusion, a constant state of not knowing what you want, who you are, what matters. Anxiety, because without a center, every decision feels equally arbitrary, equally terrifying. And beneath it all, a haunting sense that you are living the wrong life, that somewhere, somehow, you took a wrong turn and can no longer find your way back. Jung described this state with precision. The persona is a complicated system of relations between the individual and society, a kind of mask designed to make a definite impression upon others and to conceal the true nature of the individual. But when this mask becomes identified with the true self, the individual loses contact with their own inner reality. The danger is that the persona is so convincing, the role so well played, that even you believe it. You forget there is anything beneath the surface. You become the mask. This is the trap. Excessive persona living prevents you from knowing yourself. And without self-knowledge, you are condemned to wander, lost in a landscape that never quite feels like home. Seeking direction from every external source because you have lost access to your own internal compass. Moreover, the uncentered psyche is a psyche vulnerable to possession, Jung's term for when unconscious forces take over your life without your awareness. You do not choose your reactions, they choose you. You do not direct your life, it directs you. Because there is no conscious center strong enough to integrate the opposing forces within. The psyche needs a center, Jung insisted. Without it, we are at the mercy of every passing influence, every external expectation, every unconscious complex that rises up to take control. The philosopher Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. But what about he who has no who to be?" What happens when the fundamental question is not about purpose, but about identity? When you do not know who you are, every path feels wrong. Every choice feels like a betrayal of something you cannot name. This is not indecisiveness. This is psychological homelessness. And it is precisely this state that creates what we call confusion. Because confusion is not the absence of information. It is the absence of center. It is what happens when you are so far from your psychological ground that nothing resonates. Nothing feels true. As Jung stated, your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. But what happens when we have spent so long looking outside that we no longer know how to look within? When we have become so identified with the persona that the very idea of an inner self feels foreign or terrifying. In the next part, we will explore this consequence more deeply, how confusion in our time is not a sign of weakness or indecision, but the urgent signal of a psyche crying out for integration, for wholeness, for a return to center. It is common to hear people say, "I don't know who I am anymore. I feel like I am living someone else's life. Nothing feels right, but I cannot figure out what is wrong." These are not just expressions of uncertainty. They are diagnostic statements. In a world obsessed with optimization, success, external achievement, feeling confused is treated as a personal failure, as if you simply need to think harder, decide faster, get clearer about your goals. But what if the truth is completely different? What if this confusion is not a problem to solve, but a message to hear? In this context, confusion is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is the psyche's way of saying, this is not your life. This path does not lead to your center. You have wandered too far from who you truly are. It is the internal warning system, the psychological equivalent of pain, alerting you that something is fundamentally misaligned. It's not that you lack clarity. It's that you have been seeking clarity in the wrong direction, looking outward for an answer that can only be found within. It's not that you cannot decide. It's that you have been trying to choose between options that all belong to someone else's life. The symptom of confusion reveals a painful truth. We are trying to force certainty where there is a lack of authenticity. We are trying to find our way using someone else's map. And the psyche knows it. It feels when something is false, when there is no resonance, when we are merely playing a role to perfection while dying inside. Imagine a tree whose roots have been cut, whose trunk has been moved from soil to concrete. Can it stand? Maybe, with external support. But it will never feel stable, never truly grow, never bear fruit. This is what happens to the human psyche when it is severed from its center, when it lives entirely in the persona, in adaptation, in performance. Confusion in this case is not a cognitive problem. It is an existential one. It is the soul saying, we cannot continue like this. It is the self demanding to be recognized. You warned about this repeatedly with clinical precision. Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. The confusion, the anxiety, the sense of being lost, these are not diseases. They are symptoms of a psyche that has lost its way, symptoms of living in exile from yourself. What you need is not more information, not another framework or system or method. What you need is return. And that is where we enter the profound wisdom of Carl Jung, who descended into his own psychological underworld and emerged with a map, not to fix yourself, but to find yourself. In the next part, we will explore the heart of Jung's psychology, the concept of the self as center, and the process of individuation as the journey home. Because real clarity does not come from thinking harder, it comes from standing in the right place, from being centered. And from that center, everything else becomes clear. In one of the most pivotal periods of his life, Carl Jung experienced what many would call a breakdown. After his break with Freud, Jung descended into a profound psychological crisis. Plagued by visions, overwhelmed by unconscious material, uncertain whether he was going mad. He could have medicated, numbed, distracted himself. Instead, he did something radical. He turned toward the chaos. He began to dialogue with his unconscious, to record his visions in what would become the Red Book, to confront the fragmented pieces of his own psyche. And through this terrifying journey, he discovered something extraordinary. Beneath the chaos, beneath the conflicting voices and competing impulses, there was a center, an organizing principle he called the self. Jung realized that the human psyche is not a random collection of thoughts, feelings, and memories. It has an inherent structure, a natural ordering principle. And at the heart of this structure is the self, the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, integrated. The self is not the ego, the small I that makes decisions and navigates daily life. The self is larger, deeper. It is the archetype of wholeness, the psychological center of gravity that holds everything together. When you are connected to the self, you know who you are, not because you can explain it in words, but because you feel grounded, centered, at home in your own being. When you are disconnected, confusion reigns. For Jung, the central task of human life is individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are. This is not about self-improvement or achievement. It is about integration, about bringing the unconscious into consciousness, about withdrawing projections, recognizing your shadow, integrating the parts of yourself you have denied or repressed. It is the journey from living in the persona, from being what others expect, to living from the self, from being authentically who you are. The most impressive aspect of Jung's work is his insistence that this journey is not optional. If you do not individuate, if you do not undertake the work of becoming whole, you will remain fragmented, neurotic, at the mercy of unconscious forces you did not choose. The unlived life, he said, does not go away. It is lived from within, as neurosis, as symptom, as confusion. This completely challenges the modern approach, which says, gather more information, optimize your choices, follow the right system. Jung reverses this. You do not find yourself by looking outward. You find yourself by going inward, by confronting what you have avoided, by integrating what you have split off, by making conscious what has been unconscious. The self is not something you create. It is something you discover. It has always been there, waiting, beneath the layers of persona, beneath the adaptations and performances and fears. And when you finally make contact with it, everything changes. Not because your external life necessarily changes, but because you are no longer scattered. You are centered. And this understanding transforms everything. If confusion is disconnection from center, then the solution is not more external clarity, but inner integration. If you feel lost, it is not because the world is too complex. It is because you have lost contact with your own ground. Jung invites us to ask a different question. Not what should I do, but who am I beneath all the roles, all the expectations, all the masks? And that question cannot be answered intellectually. It must be lived into through the process of individuation, through the courageous journey inward. As Jung stated, your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. And that awakening, that return to center, is not a luxury. It is a psychological necessity. But how does one make this journey in a world that constantly pulls you outward? How do you return to center when everything around you demands you live from the surface? In the next part, we will explore exactly that: the practices of inner work, confrontation with the shadow, and the cultivation of psychological depth as the pathway home. In a world that glorifies constant activity, productivity, and external engagement, talking about inner work sounds almost subversive. To suggest that you need to spend time alone, in reflection, confronting uncomfortable truths about yourself, feels countercultural. But it is precisely in this inward turn, this descent into your own depths, that the pathway to center reveals itself. The modern person has been conditioned to avoid the underworld. They cannot tolerate sitting with themselves, do not know how to face their shadow, do not know how to be still without distraction. But this avoidance, this flight from the interior, is not protection, it is exile. The inner world, Jung insisted, is not optional. It is not a hobby for the spiritually inclined. It is the ground of your being. And when you refuse to enter it, you remain homeless in your own life. Jung was emphatic about this. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Because it is in the darkness, in the shadow, in the rejected and repressed parts of yourself that your lost center resides. You cannot become whole by only embracing what is acceptable. You must integrate what you have denied. This means something specific. You must turn toward what you have been avoiding. The anger you pretend you do not feel, the desires you have labeled as wrong, the parts of yourself that do not fit the persona, the dreams you abandoned because they were impractical, the grief you never processed, the truth you have been hiding even from yourself. This is shadow work, and it is not comfortable, but it is essential. Because every time you reject a part of yourself, you lose a piece of your center. You become more fragmented, more scattered, more confused. Jung said, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And this darkness is not evil. It is simply what you have refused to acknowledge, and it holds tremendous energy. When you reclaim your shadow, when you integrate what you have split off, something miraculous happens. You become more whole, more real, more yourself. The persona begins to soften, not because you abandon it, but because it is no longer the only thing you know. Beneath it, you feel the presence of something deeper, the self. And from this place, decisions become clearer, not because you suddenly have all the answers, but because you have a center to decide from. You know what resonates and what does not. The pathway to this center is not complicated, though it is demanding. It requires solitude, not loneliness, but intentional time alone, without distraction. It requires honest self-reflection, looking at your life, your patterns, your choices without judgment, but with curiosity. It requires active imagination, engaging with your dreams, your fantasies, the images that arise from the unconscious. It requires dialogue with yourself, not the surface chatter of the mind, but the deeper listening, the questions you have been afraid to ask, the answers you have been afraid to hear. As Jung wrote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this requires that you stop performing long enough to discover what is true. Stop seeking validation long enough to validate yourself. Stop living from the outside in and begin living from the inside out. This is not selfish. It is essential. Because an uncentered person brings chaos into the world. A centered person brings presence, clarity, the ability to respond rather than react. In the next part, we will address how to move from understanding to embodiment, how to take these insights and live them, how to return to center not as a one-time event, but as a daily practice. Because individuation is not a destination. It is a lifelong journey, and every moment offers the choice to scatter or to center, to perform or to be real, to remain confused or to come home. There comes a moment when you can no longer continue living from the outside, a moment when the confusion becomes unbearable, when the persona cracks, when you realize that no amount of external success, approval, or achievement can fill the emptiness of being disconnected from yourself. This is the moment of rupture. And paradoxically, it is also the moment of possibility, because it is when you stop seeking answers outside and finally turn inward that the journey home begins. True centeredness is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with fanfare or sudden revelations. It emerges quietly as you consistently choose authenticity over performance, as you make space for your own truth, as you stop abandoning yourself for the comfort of others. It is a subtle but unshakable knowing, a sense of standing on solid ground even when the world around you shifts. And this does not require perfection. It does not demand that you have it all figured out. It starts with something much simpler, with the willingness to stop pretending, with the courage to ask, who am I really beneath all of this? With the decision to spend time in your own interior, to listen to what has been ignored, to integrate what has been denied, to live from your center rather than your mask. Because centeredness is not about withdrawal or isolation. It is about presence. You can be fully engaged in the world, in relationships, in work, in life, but you are no longer scattered. You are no longer living someone else's story. You are here, rooted, grounded, able to act not from compulsion or expectation, but from genuine choice. Confusion is not a character flaw. It is a signal that you have lost your center, that you have been living too long in adaptation, too long performing, too far from your own truth. It is an invitation to stop, to descend, to return home. Jung survived his own descent into psychological darkness and emerged with a liberating truth. The foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. But he also showed that on the other side of that suffering, on the other side of the courageous journey inward, lies wholeness, lies the self, lies home. You still have that choice, even now, in this moment. And you can use it to interrupt the cycle of confusion, to step off the treadmill of external validation and begin the journey inward to becoming not what the world says you should be, but who you actually are at the deepest level. If this message resonated with you, tell us in the comments. What persona are you ready to let go of? What will you finally stop pretending? And if this clarity speaks to you, keep watching. The next video will guide you deeper. It may be exactly what your psyche needs to hear. Because the journey to center does not end here. It is only beginning.